They say the wind never stops howling in Blackroot Hollow, like the land itself remembers every scream. The hollow stretched out beneath the bone-white cliffs like a wound that never healed. Pines stood like blackened matchsticks along the ridges, their charred trunks a reminder of the wildfire that ate through the valley years after the mines gave up their last breath. Dust didn't drift in the air so much as hang there, like ash suspended in mourning. Every path into Blackroot was cracked and narrow, twisted between stone spines and sinkholes the size of wagons. Time had gone brittle here. Once, wagons came in steady chains. Miners poured through like ants, chasing veins of silver so rich they said even the crows wore rings. But that was before the collapse, before the mountain swallowed 40 men and buried their breath. No one dared dig after that. The town dried up like a gut-shot mule, and the hollow was left to the ghosts, or worse, to whatever called the wind its own. On the outskirts of what used to be Dry Communion sat a weather-worn ranch house, half buried in brush, its barn still standing like a stubborn tooth in the jaw of the earth. Thatcher Briggs lived there, or maybe waited was a better word. He was a big man, taller than most, but all the weight had slipped from him over the years. His hair had gone white, his hands the color of old saddle leather, and his face was a map of creases you couldn't follow twice. He had once been a preacher, they said, though no one alive remembered hearing him deliver a sermon. He kept to himself, riding into town maybe twice a season for salt and nails. He spoke to his horses, though. Soft words. Prayers, maybe. And sometimes he spoke to the crosses behind his house, the little patch of field he called his church. Locals called him the Keeper, though whether it was out of respect or unease, no one quite knew. They said he'd buried a wife out there, but no one ever saw the grave get dug. Just one day, the sound of a woman's voice stopped coming from the ranch, and Thatcher never explained why. His horses were unlike any others. Scarred, limping, a few blind in one eye, creatures others would have shot without a second thought. But Thatcher took them in, tended to them like they were blood. Some said he did the same with dogs once, even coyotes. One man claimed he saw a fox eating from Thatcher's hand. When the wind howled, and it always did in Blackroot, Thatcher never flinched. Just looked up toward the cliffs like he was waiting for something to come back down. It was one of those mornings, thick with rolling thunder and rain that smelled like iron, when he found her. Behind the barn, in the blackest patch of mud, lay a girl. Or a woman, maybe. It was hard to tell beneath the grime and blood. Her dress was torn like it had been caught in bramble and dragged. Her hair was matted to her skull. One foot was bare, the other swollen, in a split boot. She looked half drowned and wholly broken, curled up like a child hiding from a storm that had already passed. Thatcher didn't move for a long time, just stood there, watching the rise and fall of her back. She was breathing, not dying, but close enough to it. He stepped closer, the leather of his boots squelching into the soaked earth. Rain beat down on the barn roof, sharp and steady. When he knelt beside her, she flinched and tried to crawl, but her limbs gave out. Then she spoke. Not to him. Not really. Lori. Sam, oh God, where's Jonah? Her voice was raw, like her throat had been scrubbed with sand. And then she whispered it. Calico. The word hung in the air like smoke from a shot. Thatcher stared down at her. Something flickered in his eyes. Not surprise. Not even recognition, but wait. Like that one word confirmed something he'd feared for a long time. He slowly removed his hat and pressed it to his chest. Rain ran down the creases of his face, his shirt already soaked through. Get up, girl, he said, voice like gravel dragging over stone. You're mine now. He didn't mean it like a command, and not like a claim either. It was something else entirely older. A right, maybe. A promise. She looked up at him, eyes wide and wild. But she didn't scream. Didn't run. Maybe she knew something, too. Or maybe she saw what others missed in Thatcher Briggs, that whatever haunted him didn't come from outside the hollow. It had always lived inside him, waiting. The fever broke on the third morning. She woke with the taste of iron on her tongue and the smell of horses in her nose. A ruffled blanket covered her, stiff with age and smoke. The mattress beneath her felt like pâté. The frame creaked when she shifted. Her limbs ached like she'd fallen from the sky, and her lips split when she tried to speak. The girl, who wasn't really a girl, and who wasn't called Calico, not truly, blinked into the dim light of a one-room loft above the barn, alone but not forgotten. Down below, she could hear the creak of harnesses and the soft whicker of horses. There was a presence down there, steady and grounded. Thatcher Briggs didn't speak as he worked, but she could feel his movement, like the way a tree senses wind through its roots. She sat up too fast, the pain flashing white-hot in her chest, and leaned over to vomit into a bucket someone had mercifully placed beside the bed. She wiped her mouth on the back of her arm, eyes sweeping the room. A tin basin of water, clean clothes folded at the end of the bed, a crust of bread wrapped in cloth, half-eaten. Someone had been caring for her, not like a nurse, like a caretaker of wounded animals. She didn't remember how she'd gotten there. The days before were like shattered glass, scattered and sharp. She had a sense of running, of screams. A name whispered in her head, Calico, but it didn't belong to her. Or maybe it did now. Thatcher didn't ask who she was. When she limped out of the loft 3 days later and stood blinking in the sun, he handed her a hoe without a word and pointed to the brittle field beyond the barn. She took it. They worked in silence. She watched him. How he moved slow but deliberate. How he murmured to the horses like they were children. She learned to split fence posts, to scrape rot from troughs, to boil coffee over a cedar fire. He showed her how to stitch a saddle and dress a wound, and in return, she cleaned the barn so thoroughly it smelled like pine. They didn't speak of what was before. They didn't need to. Each bore scars the other didn't question. At night, she'd sit outside the barn, fingers stained with dirt, eyes tracing the cliffside beyond the valley. She couldn't shake the feeling that something watched her from up there, something patient. And somewhere inside her, the name Calico started to feel less borrowed. Word travels even in dead towns. By the second week, Dry Communion was whispering. A freckled boy delivering nails to the general store claimed he saw a woman walking Thatcher Briggs's fence line. A stable hand said she was pale and barefoot and moved like she didn't weigh more than a lantern shadow. Folks in Dry Communion didn't like mysteries. Not after what happened years back. Marshal Elias Parnell came 3 days later. He rode up the ridge under a sun that burned straight down, a Bible tucked behind his saddle horn and 2 pistols holstered high. His coat was black, his voice low and crisp. The townsfolk called him the Reverend, though he never preached a word. His justice was scripture enough. He asked Thatcher once, "You alone out here?" Thatcher met his gaze and said nothing. Parnell let the silence stretch. The sun beat down like a judgment. Then he tipped his hat and rode on. Under the floorboards of the house, curled in the crawlspace, Calico didn't move. She listened to the horses snort as they watched the marshal ride off. She didn't ask what he knew, and Thatcher didn't ask what she was running from. That night, the wind changed. It blew hard through the hollow, carrying a cold not born from sky or storm. Calico sat bolt upright in bed, heart hammering. The air was thick, metallic, like the breath of old stone. She heard it first in her dreams, whispers, men's voices echoing down a shaft, boots scuffing against gravel, and something else, the lullaby, sung by a voice no longer alive. She saw figures in her mind, shadowed men with hollow eyes, helmets dimly lit, and behind them, a pale child with no mouth, pointing toward the cliffs. The next night, she followed the sound. Barefoot and half-dreaming, she stepped into the moonlight and walked past the barn. The horses stirred but didn't whinny. Even the crickets stopped. Something led her to a patch of earth behind the corral, a place the grass never grew. She dropped to her knees and dug with her bare hands. The soil came up wet, like something had bled into it. Her fingers struck metal. She pulled. It was a necklace, its chain broken, its pendant caked with rust-red grime. She turned it over and wiped it clean. Etched into the back were 3 letters, M.B. She stared at it. The initials rang like a bell through her head. Later, she found Thatcher sitting by the barn with a lantern, as if he'd been waiting. She didn't speak. She just held out the necklace. He took it, closed his fist around it like it burned. Thatcher spoke that night, his voice like gravel wet from rain. She disappeared the same day the mine gave out. He didn't look at her as he said it, just stared into the fire. They said it was the blast. Too much dynamite. She was up on the ridge with the others. They told me she must have slipped, or that she ran in trying to save someone. But I knew that wasn't it. Calico listened, her legs drawn up to her chest. She wasn't inside that shaft. I know because I felt it. I came home and the door was open. Her boots were gone. No footprints. No blood. Nothing. He opened his hand and looked down at the necklace. This was all I ever found. Weeks later, buried where you found it. Silence stretched between them. They thought I'd gone mad. Said the grief turned my gut. But I know that mountain didn't just take her. Something else did. The mine collapse was cover. They made it look like a mistake, but it was a hiding place. Calico felt the chill creep into her bones. "What do you think took her?" she asked softly. He looked at her then, and his eyes were darker than night. "I don't know, but I think it's still hungry." The wind outside shifted again, and deep beneath the cliffs, something rumbled, not like thunder, but breath. Calico didn't sleep that night, and when she closed her eyes, she dreamed of a woman wearing the same necklace, standing in a cavern of bone, whispering a name not yet remembered. The wind was quieter now. Not gone, just waiting. Calico, though the name was beginning to feel like borrowed cloth, woke with her hands clutched around the necklace, its cold metal pressed into her skin. Dreams had unraveled in her sleep, tangled threads slipping loose. A tent lit by oil lanterns, laughter echoing through the dusk, the scent of lavender and snake oil on a traveling wagon, and a face her own, painted white with rouge and powdered rice, smiling beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Her name wasn't Calico. Not truly. She remembered a stage. She remembered music. A caravan of performers, healers, fortune sellers. A traveling medicine troupe that made its way from Kansas to the edge of Blackroot Hollow, stopping only long enough to trade stories and sell hope in bottled glass. She remembered the night it ended. Men with torches, voices thick with liquor and hate. They came not to steal, but to erase. One of them wore a marshal's badge. Another wore a preacher's collar. Screams in the dark. Smoke swallowing the sky. She remembered crawling through tall grass. Her ribs broken, blood in her eyes. One of her friends had tried to run. Lori. She had whispered it while dying, grabbing at Isolde's face. "Calico, it's underrun." It wasn't a name. It was a place. Her real name was Isolde Ray. The girl behind the barn had died that night. What stood now was something rebuilt, carried forward on the strength of a whisper. Isolde went to Thatcher. She told him everything. And he, without hesitation, nodded once. "Then it's time we go where they think we won't." That evening, they saddled 2 horses and rode toward the cliffs. There was a shaft beneath the eastern ridge, mostly forgotten. Locals said it was sealed after the collapse, and Thatcher never argued. He had never told anyone he kept the key. The wind howled louder the closer they came, as if protesting. As they dismounted, Isolde felt her fingers tremble. Thatcher placed a hand on her shoulder. "You can stop now." She shook her head. "I've stopped enough." He pried loose a rusted gate hidden behind a tumble of rocks and brush. The darkness beyond was absolute. They lit lanterns and stepped inside. The shaft descended at a steady slope, air thick with dust and time. Isolde's breath came shallow. The deeper they went, the colder the earth became. Walls narrowed and the timbers creaked like bones, shifting in sleep. They passed collapsed tunnels. Cart rails twisted like worms. Then the carvings began. Etched into the walls were symbols neither of them recognized. Spirals. Circles nested within jagged triangles. Some looked like eyes. Some like mouths with no end. Along the floor lay bones. Not scattered, but arranged, stacked neatly against the walls in shapes too precise for chance. The shaft opened into a dome-shaped cavern, far too wide to be a mine. A chapel carved from stone. It wasn't Christian. It wasn't human. Silhouettes lined the walls, the outlines of women burned into rock, their bodies arched as if in worship or agony. Above them, a ceiling painted in faded red, a ring of faceless figures surrounding a pit of flame. In the center of the cavern stood a pedestal. On it lay a locket. Thatcher reached for it with trembling hands. He didn't need to open it to know. It was hers. Mary Briggs. Isolde knelt beside him, and her eyes caught a glint just beyond the pedestal, half buried in stone. Another locket. Identical. 2 offerings. Isolde rose slowly. This was never about the mine. No, Thatcher said. It was about what they fed it. They returned to town under cover of dusk. The streets of Dry Communion were quiet, save for the clink of glasses behind shuttered saloon windows. They went straight to the old church. Ada Merrow hadn't left the church in years. Some said she'd gone blind. Others said she'd seen too much. The bell tower above her room hadn't rung since the day of the collapse. Thatcher knocked once. The door creaked open. She sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets stitched with crow feathers, her eyes cloudy, but not unseeing. "Took you long enough," she rasped. Isolde stepped forward. "You knew." Ada didn't answer immediately, just stared into the flames. "We all did. The first women went missing before the mine struck its first vein. Folks thought it was just the wild. Then one came back, eyes like ash. Said the mountain gave her a dream." Thatcher's voice was low. "A pact." Ada nodded. The Hollow always wanted something. The founders gave it wives, daughters. In exchange, the cliffs gave gold, silver, stone that burned blue. We built Dry Communion from it. "And the collapse?" Isolde asked. "A mistake. Or maybe the Hollow changed its mind." Thatcher turned the locket over in his hand. "Mary, she wasn't the first." Ada's voice broke, but she might have been the last who went down alive. Thunder cracked in the distance. The fire hissed. Ada's eyes turned to Isolde. "You have to leave, before it finds you again." Isolde's jaw tightened. "It already has." The next morning, Parnell rode to the church. He found Thatcher and Isolde standing out front. The townsfolk watched from doorways. No one spoke. "You went below," Parnell said, not asking. "We found what you buried," Isolde answered. The marshal's face was still, carved in cold stone. "You've broken the covenant," he said, voice flat. She was meant to return. Thatcher stepped forward. "You still believe that?" Parnell's hand dropped to his revolver. "I believe in balance. I believe in what was promised." Isolde stared at him. "You helped kill my family." His expression didn't change. "They trespassed. They brought light to a place built on shadow." She shook her head. "You're not protecting the town. You're protecting yourself." Parnell's voice dropped. "That thing in the Hollow, it remembers who broke faith." He turned to the crowd, raised his voice. "These two are heretics. They've trespassed into sacred ground and brought death back with them. I invoke the rights of red judgment. By flame or soil, they must be returned." No one moved. The silence was heavier than any shout. "Do it," he barked. Still, no one stepped forward. Isolde met Thatcher's eyes. "We need to run." "No," he said. "We stand." Parnell's eyes narrowed. "Then the Hollow will take you both." He turned his horse, spurred it hard, and rode back into the hills, toward the mine, toward the chapel. As he vanished beyond the ridge, the wind in the Hollow began to howl again. Not like breath, like song. They left the ranch under moonless dark, the horses silent beneath them as if even they knew not to make a sound. Smoke still rose from the distant ridge. Parnell's men had set fire to the far field, hoping to flush them out. But Thatcher knew the land better than any lawman. He didn't take the main road or the deer trail. He led her into the salt draw. It was a dry riverbed carved ages ago by water that no longer came. Now it lay like a scar through the Hollow, wide, cracked, and lifeless. No trees grew along its path, just crumbling salt pillars and the bones of animals too stubborn to turn back. It was said wolves haunted the draw, not the kind with fur, but the kind with eyes like mirrors, spirits who walked on 4 legs by day and 2 by night. Calico believed it. They made camp beneath a twisted cedar that hadn't bloomed in years. The ground was hard, the air dry as old paper. Calico couldn't sleep. Neither could Thatcher. He knelt near the edge of camp, drawing strange shapes in the dust with a piece of bone. He spoke no words, but his hands moved with practiced rhythm. The wind shifted slightly, curling away from them. She stepped beside him. "You were never just a preacher, were you?" He didn't stop moving. "I was once." "What are you now?" He looked up at her. A man trying to unmake the lies he helped build. Calico said nothing, but she didn't sleep that night, either. The firelight from the past flickered back into Thatcher's eyes as he stared at the symbols. Once, he had worn robes of silver-threaded linen. Once, he stood in the same stone chapel beneath the ridge, surrounded by men who called themselves shepherds of the hollow. They had spoken of balance, of peace through offering. The town was young then. Dry Communion hadn't even been named. It was just a settlement clinging to the edge of the canyon. When the mountain first gave up its silver, the elders whispered of howling in the night. Men vanished. Women woke screaming. The earth demanded something in return. Thatcher had believed them. He had written sermons, led prayers that were more spell than scripture. He'd recited verses etched in forgotten tongues. And when the first offering was chosen, he stood at the altar and did not speak. Until they named Mary, he had been willing to deceive, to obey, to keep the peace. But not her. Not the only person who ever looked past his voice and saw the man beneath it. She had been his balance. And when she was taken, the mountain didn't just open. He did. He burned the books, killed one of the elders in his sleep, faked her burial, faked his grief, and he vanished, took a new name, became the keeper of ruined things. He waited, buried bones when he found them, helped lost creatures find quiet death or stubborn survival. And then one day Calico, Noah's old, came crawling out of the hollow's mud like a prayer returned. He was never supposed to survive this long, but she was. They rode back into Dry Communion before dawn. The locket gleamed against Calico's throat. Her boots were caked in cave dust. The satchel on her back held bones wrapped in linen and truth wrapped in silence. The townsfolk watched from behind curtains. Doors didn't open. The chapel's bell was silent. Parnell waited in the square, his coat lined with gold thread stitching. He stood with 3 deputies behind him, a rifle in hand and something colder in his eyes. Thatcher threw the satchel at his feet. It landed with a sickening clatter. Calico stepped forward and unfastened the locket. She held it high for all to see. "Mary Briggs," she said, and another just like it, offered like cattle. Ada Merrow emerged from the chapel steps, voice thin but fierce. They buried the truth with silver. "Thatcher speaks it now." The people murmured. Parnell's voice cracked like a whip. "Enough." He pointed at Calico. "She's the mouth of the hollow. That thing speaks through her. And now she brings bones to raise the dead." Thatcher's voice cut low. "She brings justice. Something you wouldn't recognize if it carved your name in stone." Parnell raised his rifle. "She's a curse." But Calico's eyes, wide, wet and burning, flared red. Blood began to stream from them, down her cheeks like tears. Her lips parted, and out came a voice that wasn't hers. It was many voices, some sobbing, some screaming, some just whispering the same name over and over. Asterisk Calico. 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 Asterisk. Women long dead. Children stolen. Wives sacrificed. The town's secrets poured out of her mouth like floodwater, ancient and undeniable. People fell to their knees. Some ran. Others simply wept. And Parnell screamed. He raised the rifle. His hands were steady. He didn't shout. He simply fired. The shot tore the silence apart. Thatcher moved before anyone else could. He stepped in front of Calico. The bullet caught him in the ribs. He staggered, blood spraying across the chapel stones, knees buckling. Calico cried out, catching him as he fell. Her hands pressed to his wound, useless, frantic. Parnell dropped the rifle and reached for his sidearm, but she was already moving. The locket in her hand snapped open. Inside was a blade, thin, curved, forged from hollow ore, the kind once used in rituals. She buried it in Parnell's chest. He gasped. His eyes went wide, and he crumpled to the dust, dead before he hit the ground. Thatcher's breath rattled, but he smiled. He touched her cheek with a shaking hand. "You see," he whispered, "you were always meant to finish it." And the hollow, at last, went silent. The shot echoed through the cliffs like a bell rung at the end of the world. Parnell's body lay twisted in the chapel's hollow, his blood seeping into the altar stone, where so many had been offered before him. The mountain did not roar. It sighed. Thatcher Briggs stood with one hand pressed to his side, the dark stain spreading fast. Isolde, no longer calico, not quite Isolde, held him up, her hands soaked in his blood, trying to keep the weight of him from the ground, but he was already sagging like an old tree finally giving in. His breath came slow, eyes locked not on her, but on the shaft beyond, where faint echoes still seemed to whisper names long buried. "You were never mine," he said, voice barely louder than the wind. "I was always yours." She shook her head, lips trembling. "Don't." But he only smiled faint, like the memory of a sunrise. "Tell her, Mary." I waited. He pulled something from around his neck, a simple band of iron, dull and blackened with age. "From the first shaft, the first breath of this place. Give it to her when you see her." And with that, Thatcher Briggs, the last of the old blood, the quiet preacher who buried more than most men, had the strength to remember, closed his eyes, and let go. Dry communion changed after that. The mine was never sealed again, but no one dug for ore. No one brought torches or chisels or drills. The shafts became catacombs. Pilgrims came not for riches, but to bury the bones unearthed after the storm, bones of wives and daughters and sisters never spoken of in old town ledgers. No one called them lost anymore. They called them the returned. Isolde stayed behind. She lived in the ranch house Thatcher left her. She kept the barn, tended the scarred horses. People came to her with questions, and sometimes she answered. Most of the time, she only listened. They stopped calling her Calico. No one remembered where the name came from, and no one dared ask. Instead, they called her Mother Hollow. Children said she could speak to the dead, that the wind listened to her when it passed through the ridge, that when you cried at night, she'd leave milk and honey on your doorstep by dawn. They say she never aged, that her face stayed just as it was the day she stood over Thatcher's grave. Some believe she died long ago, and the hollow simply refused to let her go. Not because it owned her, because she understood it, and because she listened. Years later, after memory faded and maps left the hollow blank again, a rider came seeking her. He wasn't from any town nearby, dust-covered, sunburned, with a rifle across his back and grief heavy in his saddlebag. He had heard stories in a saloon 2 counties west, about a woman who lived where no birds flew, who knew the names of the dead even when the living had forgotten. The wind met him before the trees did. Sharp, cold, familiar. He rode up the path to the old ranch. The barn still stood. The fence still bowed like an old man's spine. And in the mud behind the barn, half buried in shadow, he saw her. A girl, young, eyes closed, barefoot, curled into herself like something sleeping off pain. He dismounted, approached slow, careful not to startle her. She didn't move. She was covered in dust and blood and rain, like someone had poured the hollow itself over her. He removed his hat. "Get up, girl," he said, voice soft as morning. "You're hers now." The girl stirred, eyes fluttering open. She didn't speak, but she followed. The rider led her into the house, where a fire still burned though no one had fed it, where bread sat warm on the counter and water poured itself from the kettle. He didn't question it. The hollow was awake. Some say the girl became like the woman before her, that she stayed, learned to tend the land, and heard the whispers in the cliffs at night. Some say it's not a person who watches the hollow, but a presence that simply wears their faces. Some say Calico still walks the ridge, barefoot, waiting, not for revenge, not for salvation, but for understanding. The hollow remembers. It always does. And now it chooses who to keep. In Blackroot Hollow, the earth remembers everything, and the women who rise from its mud remember even more.